This is a fun day for all of us because we get to hear our 5 sub-Is who were marvelous this month to speak. We're going to start out, and I'm going to ask each of you just to relax you a little, Mohammed. One thing we don't know about you from your CV, some hobby or something like that, but Muhammad Ali is the first to speak from Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Tell me one fun fact about yourself.
All right, thank you, Dr. Alan Logan. So I guess a fun fact about me would be that I like to take Amtrak rides for fun and for the views across the country. One I'd recommend is the Ethan Allen Express from New York up the Hudson River all the way to Vermont, especially during the fall. It's one of the most beautiful train rides you could take.
Oh, that's a great tip. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
that's great. All right, tell us what you're going to talk about.
Yeah, so today I'm going to be presenting on microvascular contributions to dementia. This is a culmination of my work from my undergraduate years at Cornell University, as well as my time as a medical student at Mount Sinai. These are our disclosures. So taking a look at the big picture of neurologic diseases in the United States, what we see is that the age-adjusted mortality rate for cerebrovascular disease has been slowly declining over the past 20 years. But we see this concomitant increase in the rise of mortalities that are caused by neurodegenerative diseases. And this research project is really at the confluence of these two broad neurologic disease categories, specifically how the cerebrovascular system contributes to neurodegeneration and dementia. So perfusion MRI has revealed that up to 40% reduction in blood flow is evident in patients and mouse models of Alzheimer's disease. And though we know that reduction in cerebral blood flow to the brain likely decrease or contribute actually to cognitive impairment, the origins of these blood flow reductions remain unclear. That is until 2 recent seminal papers that demonstrate microvasculature, specifically capillaries of the brain, lead to reduced brain blood flow. First, out of the Atwell lab at the University of London, demonstrated that amyloid beta signals to parasites to constrict capillaries and lead to blood flow reduction in Alzheimer's disease. And then second, out of Cornell University, where I worked, demonstrated that neutrophils adhere to brain capillaries, causing these miniature stalls or strokes in capillaries, which lead to a reduction in cerebral blood flow and impairment in memory function of Alzheimer's disease. So the way we're able to image these mice is first we acquire optical access to the brain via a cranial window. Then we use 2-photon excited fluorescent microscopy to be able to image the mice cortex up to 1,000 microns deep at a resolution fine enough to track the movement of red blood cells across the length of a capillary. And what we find is this interesting phenomenon where a fraction of capillaries do not have red blood cell movement across the length of the capillary over time. Here indicated by the blood cells indicated by lack of Texas red dye, whereas most capillaries are flowing. And we see this is a 300 micron stack of an Alzheimer's mice and a wild-type mouse. And we see is that the Alzheimer's mice has a much greater incidence of stalled capillaries, which leads to reduced blood flow as compared to the wild-type mice. Here, 15 stalled capillaries marked by the red circles in the Alzheimer's mice, and only 3 in the wild-type mice in the same 300 micron section of the cortex. Next, we wanted to explore what causes capillary stalls, and what we found was that most of them are comprised of white blood cells. 70% of cells have leukocytes within them. And then in our preliminary experiment, we knocked out white blood cells, specifically neutrophils, and what we were able to do was improve cerebral blood flow, improve memory cognition in the mice, and reduce amyloid burden. But this isn't a therapy that would be possible in humans because it would leave them neutropenic and immunocompromised. So that's where my research project came in. I wanted to try and figure out an indirect way of inhibiting stall formation to provide a potential therapeutic way of targeting this phenomenon in humans. And what we found in the literature was that in wild-type mice, VEGF, vascular endothelial growth factor receptor 2, inhibition improved clearance of microsphere-induced wild-type brain obstructions or stalls, and that serum VEGF levels are vastly dysregulated in Alzheimer's disease, mice and patients. So the hypothesis of the project was that if you could inhibit peripheral VEGF signaling, could that release these capillary stalls and address brain blood flow reduction in Alzheimer's disease mice? So for the project, we had 4 sets of mice, 2 Alzheimer's, 2 wild type, 1 receiving the anti-VEGF antibody, and 1 just receiving saline. After craniotomy, we imaged the mice after a week of treatment and another week of treatment, and sacrificed the mice and did post-mortem analysis. We were able to image the mice and then upload our images of 1 million capillaries for this project to a citizen science platform called Stall Catchers, where 55,000 active citizen scientists rated the capillaries as either flowing or stalled. And what we found from this data analysis was that the anti-VEGF antibody administration drastically reduced the fraction of stalls, capillaries that were stalled in the Alzheimer's mice, concomitantly increased red blood cell speed and cerebral blood flow, led to a reduction in endothelial nitric oxide levels within the brain endothelial cells. Rescue of tight junction protein occludin in the endothelial cells, as evidenced by a rescue of green fluorescence in the treated mice compared to the saline treated mice, and a reduction in the extravasation of Evans blue dye across the blood-brain barrier, meaning a tightening of the blood-brain barrier with the treatment of the anti-VEGF antibody. These results were corroborated in cortical samples of humans with Alzheimer's disease. And so the idea is that this reduction in cerebral blood flow that is so evident in Alzheimer's disease is caused potentially by this transduction pathway where vascular endothelial growth factor leads to a loosening of the blood-brain barrier, which leads to extravasation of inflammatory markers into the endothelial into the capillaries, which attracts neutrophils, causes stalls, and inhibits blood flow by up to 17% in our mouse models. So the implications of this study is that drugs targeting VEGF could potentially be used to reduce cognitive impairment associated with brain blood flow reduction in Alzheimer's disease patients, as a new novel therapeutic way of targeting the disease. And then we can potentially confirm these trends in human studies intraoperatively in the OR, using, for example, laser spectral contrast imaging. Next, I want to talk about some of my clinical science work at Mount Sinai. Intracerebral hemorrhage is probably the most devastating form of stroke. 50% of patients survive, a third experience some sort of long-term cognitive impairment. And historically, surgical trials have not demonstrated improvement after clearance, functional improvements after clearance of the hematoma. But the ENRICH trial demonstrated and presented the ANS recently that clearance or evacuation of lobar hemorrhages within 24 hours of last known well improved functional outcomes at 6 months. But cognitive outcomes have not been similarly tracked in these trials. And so my research here, I did a project, complete a project where we validated the application of remote cognitive testing after surgical evacuation of ICH to make it more feasible to track cognitive outcomes in these functionally debilitated patients. Our patients undergo the stereotactic underwater blood aspiration technique, which first phase involves significant bulking of the hematoma. The second phase involves irrigation of the cavity and then active cauterization of the bleeding vessel to achieve hemostasis intercavitarially. And we hope to see some of the similar results we've seen in with functional outcomes in terms of the cognitive outcomes there, which is still being collected. But in terms of functional outcomes, we've seen that early evacuation, specifically within 12 hours of last known well, significantly is associated with improved functional outcomes at 6 months. And that almost 50% of patients who were evacuated within 12 hours had an MRS of functional independence at 6 months, and with an MRS less than or equal to 2. And that early evacuation is also associated with lower ICU length of stay, as well as a lower cost in these patients. And finally, I just wanted to demonstrate that these results also show in our cohort of mice, these radiographic evidence also backs up some of the evidence for early evacuation. Here's on the top panel here, a patient with a left basal ganglion hemorrhage, and on the bottom is a patient with a left basal ganglion hemorrhage as well. On the top patient had an evacuation within 6 hours of last known well. The bottom patient had an evacuation within 18 hours of last known well. At 1 year, the top patient had a residual cavity volume 19% of their original hematoma, whereas the bottom patient has a residual cavity volume 57% of the original hematoma lesion. The top patient achieved a MRS of 2, whereas the bottom patient had an MRS of 5. And this is a cubic spine regression model demonstrating the association between early evacuation, a lower residual cavity burden at 1 year, and good functional outcomes at 1 year. These are my acknowledgements for my basic science work at Cornell, Dr. Schaefer and Dr. Bracco, and some of the clinical science work I've done with Dr. Kellner and Dr. Mako at Mount Sinai. Thank you.
That was excellent, Mohammed, and we enjoyed having you here. Any questions? Any questions so far?
I've got one, Rich. This is Pierre. Mohammed, a lot of work. Congratulations, and very exciting work. You showed a reduction of eNOS by the anti-VEGF approach. Wouldn't a reduction of eNOS cause vasal restriction, because eNOS is a vasodilator?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we did was we also tracked, so when we were looking at cerebral blood flow reductions, we also tracked the vessel diameters. And what we found was that the vessel diameters weren't significantly different. I don't have that graph on here, but in the paper, there's that graph demonstrating that the vessel diameters weren't different, at least in the capillaries. So we saw some differences in the penetrating arterioles, but not within the capillaries. So yeah, that's a great.
The penetrating arterioles got smaller.
Not significantly though. Yeah, not significantly though. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Dr. Lowe, if you can load your slides up, that'd be great. We're thrilled to have another WashU. We have our WashU faculty and residents, and Maren is from WashU, and she's in the MST program. She's getting her PhD in engineering, and this is her talk. Maren, tell us one interesting fact about you not in your CV. Are you unmuted? Maren, we're not here.
There we go. Okay, sorry.
No.
My fun fact is that my parents and all three of my sisters and I are math people. My parents are both mathematicians, and two of my three sisters were math majors, as was I. The third one is a physical chemist, so the most math of chemistry.
Wow. Okay, that's truly impressive. So, all right, take it away.
Okay, so I will be presenting on my work from my dissertation in the engineering school at WashU. No disclosures. So the motivations for my dissertation lie at the intersection of clinical medicine, neuroscience research, and engineering methods. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to EEG and Fourier analysis, and then get into the three main aims of my dissertation. This is a brief overview. I think I've kept it to only 3 equations in the whole talk. So the main computational phenomenon that is important to understand here is that the Fourier transform allows us to write any time varying signal as the weighted sum of different sine waves or sinusoids, so that this red signal here can be estimated by different frequencies with a given amplitude and phase at that frequency. And we use this in EEG to visualize across time and frequency the power of that frequency, or the magnitude, the amplitude of that sine wave. So here we have the onset of propofol anesthesia with a dominant frequency component at 2 Hertz and 13 Hertz. So clinically, our EEG monitoring unit at St. Louis Children's Hospital uses spectrograms to visualize broad patterns over time. Our collaborators, Dr. Guerriero, Dr. Tomko, and Dr. Morrissey at St. Louis Children's Hospital in pediatric neurology identified a cohort of patients where there was this new kind of banding pattern that they identified in the spectral domain, so in that frequency domain. And this is an atypical view of that EEG. Normally they look at windows of 15, 20 seconds. This is a 5-minute trend with a 12-hour spectral trend. Zooming in, we see that kind of oscillation, that clear waxing and waning in the spectrogram across the course of 1 hour. Our collaborators were really interested in what this phenomenon is. How can we quantify it to compare it across patients? How does it manifest in different clinical populations? Their hypothesis was that it was associated with worse outcomes, higher seizure burden, poor functional outcomes down the road in kids with acquired brain injuries. And then finally, can we generate some hypotheses for what's happening here? What are the underlying dynamics in the electrophysiological activity? So as far as analysis methods, this is a new pattern. The goal here was to identify the strength of this modulation, identify the frequency at which it's happening. So taking this raw EEG signal, we obtain a spectrogram. This is 100 minutes, and we see that strong banding pattern. From there, we extract an envelope signal for each channel across a given frequency band. So this is across the alpha band. We see this oscillation in the power magnitude. We then use lasso regression to estimate the oscillation here in the envelope signal with a sparse set of sine waves, which allows us to generate an index Q, which is looking at that estimate, how sparse is the estimate, and how well does the estimate correlate with the original envelope signal. The math here is really unimportant to understand. The main idea is that we are looking for a dominant frequency that very well estimates the envelope signal, that outer oscillation. So with that, we are able to obtain this modulation index Q across 12 hours of recording, across 18 channels, and across various frequency bands that were pre-selected. From there, we're able to identify the dominant frequency and identify when this is statistically significant modulation using bootstrapping. So here for the patient on the left, there is some variability in the outer modulation across time, but it's statistically significant across all 18 channels here for most of the 12 hours versus this other patient. There is, again, some variability in the dominant frequency, but it is not statistically significant in all channels or across all 12 hours. Again, comparing two patients, we can see spatially, this top patient has widespread modulation that is significant across all 4 frequency bands that we looked at, versus this patient below has only significant modulation in the right hemisphere in the upper frequency band, so above 8 Hertz. So using this method, we were able to identify significant modulation and incorporate spatial information in addition to these kind of other statistical values that we were able to use. So then we were able to apply this to clinical EEG. This is in that first cohort of interest. We essentially found what we were looking for. Our collaborators picked out this cohort of ICU patients, and the patients who did worse, so patients with the dark circles and triangles, either died or had significant long-term comorbidities, had stronger modulation. This is what we expected to find. The kind of more interesting application, I think, is that we had a cohort of neonates with hypoxic ischemic events who had EEG monitoring within 12 hours of birth, as well as outcomes measures long-term at 18 to 24 months of age. And we found that the strength of this modulation correlated with outcomes at 18 to 24 months. So strong modulation early in life, within those first 12 to 24 hours of life, correlated with poorer cognitive and motor outcomes at 18 to 24 months of age. So those are just 2 kind of applications of this modulation. Finally, this last thing that I was working on towards the end of my PhD was computational modeling and hypothesis generation. So for one of our very early patients with this modulation, there was concurrent intracranial pressure and heart rate monitoring that we were able to obtain. And we found that in patients when there was in this patient, at times when there was significant modulation present at that roughly 7 to 8 millihertz range, there were significant modulations at that same frequency in the intracranial pressure and heart rate, leading to a hypothesis that there is some relationship between the intracranial pressure, cerebral blood flow, and the electrical activity modulation that we are seeing. We looked through the literature at various intracranial pressure wave pathology and generated a hypothesis about how blood flow, cerebral perfusion pressure, intracranial pressure interact with neural activity and cerebral blood flow. So using some existing models of plateau waves and burst suppression and how substrate affects cerebral or electrophysiologic activity, we were able to generate this computational model with induced plateau waves and concurrent kind of electrophysiological monitoring, or electrophysiological activity that recapitulates what we were seeing. This is still work in progress. The paper is in preparation. We have some fine tuning left to do on this model. But kind of in summary, these are the three main aims of my dissertation. I had a few other side projects I didn't talk about today. Publications I contributed to, as well as a few of my posters. In the future, I am working on getting this computational modeling fine tuned up so that we can send that paper out. I'm working with Dr. Jen Straley at St. Louis Children's as well on some analysis of circadian fluctuations in CSF flow. That's a project I'll be working on this upcoming year while I am actually in Washington, D.C. So I am taking another year off to do a policy fellowship in Washington, D.C., where I'll be working at the VA on compatibility of electronic health records, AI and big data, and metrics for evaluating grant success. Acknowledging the lab that I was in, as well as committee members, collaborators, and staff support. So I will now take any questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Maren, any questions for Maren? Anybody dare to ask about the equations?
I'll take a stab. It's Jeff.
Okay, I know I was
Yeah.
the only person that would be Jeff.
No, I won't touch the equations, but I don't know if they're still up there, but all the EEG on the 12th floor of St. Louis Children's. But my question is, I mean, do you think there's the interest in neuropeptides and some of these other slow potentials, does that tie into these rhythms you're seeing, or how do you, I mean, you showed nicely their association potentially with some disease states, but like, why are they there? What, is there a functional correlate to these, or they're just there because that's, our activity varies, or what's behind these very, very slow waves that just have been so understudied, and it's cool that you're looking at them.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I didn't look at anything relating to neuropeptides. I think the kind of underlying mechanism is still really in question. I believe there's some hopefully prospective data gathering. I don't know if they've started yet, but this is, NIH funded research that is underway. But definitely this kind of slow modulatory phenomenon as a field is absolutely understudied. Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question. It's sort of two-part, and it's related a bit to the last one, and that is source of modulation, and is it excitatory or inhibitory?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's unclear what the source is. We saw in some patients there was this kind of global modulation, and the more widespread it was, it seemed to be correlated with worse outcomes. It's unclear. This is EEG, so I'm not sure whether this is excitatory or inhibitory. My hypothesis is that it is excitatory. A lot of these kids had pretty high seizure burden concurrently. But again, this is kind of the first work establishing this phenomenon. And so a lot to still be learned here. Absolutely.
Thank you, Maren. That was great. All right. Next up is Kiana Prather from University of Oklahoma. Kiana, do you have your talk? We can get it up on the screen.
Yes. 1 second.
We're good. No worries.
Did we lose Kiana? I think she just dropped off.
Oh, that's exciting. All right. Well, why don't we do this? Is she coming? Is she come back on?
Oh,
No,
It looks, yeah, look, okay, it looks like she's on.
okay. There you go. We got it, Kiana. Beautiful.
Is it okay that I go ahead
Yeah,
and start?
Yep. Go ahead, start. Tell us one fun fact about you, soon to be Dr. Prather.
Okay, one fun fact about me, when I moved here from Wuhan and during high school, sorry, 1 second. Let me see if I can start my video. And I'm sorry, my video is not starting. I apologize. But one fun fact about me is when I moved here from Wuhan during high school to rural Oklahoma, I saw that all the popular kids in school were athletic, and the girls especially were softball players. So that's when I decided to join the softball team. I tried out for the softball team and I ended up playing the right field for the next 5 seasons. But however, I will have to admit, I was not always on the starting team. And
Okay,
little did I know I was getting myself ready for the neurosurgery match.
Dr. Ferreira, our coach Ferreira, is recruiting people all the time. It's unbelievable. All right, that's wonderful. All right.
Very true.
Yeah.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Kiana Prather and I'm a 4th year medical student from the University of Oklahoma. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present my work on stereotactic radial surgery for brain arterial venous malformations with a highlight on OU's first institutional series. Brain AVMs carry a 2 to 4.5% risk of hemorrhage per year, and several risk factors have been associated with higher rates of rupture. As with many other neurosurgical topics, our understanding and management of the AVMs have undergone a significant evolution in a relatively short amount of time. And as you can see here, out of the 3 main options, treatment options for AVM, which are microsurgery, endovascular embolization, and SRS. SRS is the youngest field, having only been developed and popularized within the past 5 decades. And as a result, we're still well in the process of understanding the efficacy and safety of this treatment modality. Similar to how the Spessler-Martin-Grays is used to predict surgical risk, the RBAS system developed by Dr. Pollack and Dr. Flickinger in the early 2000s is a validated scoring system used to predict AVM SRS outcomes. Lower modified RBAS is associated with better outcomes. The goal of AVM SRS is typically obliteration, and the obliteration rate reported in the literature is a bit all over the place. Unlike in surgical resection, obliteration after SRS occurs in a delayed fashion, often at about 3 years after the treatment. And during this latency period, the risk of rupture is relatively high, sometimes even higher than the natural history of an untreated, unruptured AVM. Although the Spessler-Martin grade and the subsequently established supplementary Spessler-Martin grade, also known as Lawton-Young grade, were primarily designed to predict surgical risk. Some studies have also reported on their accuracy in assessing SRS outcomes, which so far has yielded some success. The neurosurgery and rad-onc providers are treating AVM patients using gamma knife SRS for over 2 decades, but the outcomes have not yet been assessed. We therefore conducted a retrospective analysis of AVM SRS patients at OU since 2006 who had at least 12 months of imaging follow-up. Those who experienced a censoring event such as hemorrhage or death prior to 12 months were also included. We were able to identify 50 patients who fit the inclusion criteria. Notably, comorbidities among these patients, such as hypertension, smoking, and illicit drug use, were overrepresented in our cohort compared to the general population. And regarding characteristics of the AVMs, 70% of our patients had ACEs in grade 3 or higher ABM. 40% had supplementary grade 7 or and comparing this to literature, this is a significantly higher representation of the high-grade ABMs in the typical clinical cohort. And the mean modified RBAS of our cohort was higher than typically reported in the cohort studies as well. Notably, 40% of our patients had prior embolization before their SRS treatment. The majority of our patients were treated with a perfection humanized system. Most of the treatment parameters are typical compared to the literature. The median clinical follow-up was 32.5 months. We did observe, unfortunately, a quite significant loss to follow-up rate. However, for those with 3 and 5 years of imaging follow-up, the obliteration rates were 50% and 69% respectively, with the mean and median time to obliteration of 2 years. In terms of adverse outcomes, 7 patients had hemorrhage post-SRS, also at a mean of 2 years, and all of them had high-grade ABMs, with these patients actually died from the hemorrhage. This hemorrhage rate appears higher than what's reported in the literature. However, it's likely confounded by the significant loss of follow-up and the overrepresentation of high-grade ABMs in patients who met our inclusion criteria. An important question we wanted to address was how these ABM brain cells predicted obliteration in our cohort. As you can see here, using a modified Kaplan-Meier survival analysis, we found that both the modified RBAS and the supplementary special Martin grade predicted obliteration using a cutoff of 1.6 and 6, respectively. As special Martin grade alone, however, did not correlate with obliteration. Next, we set out to identify patient-specific factors associated with outcomes. Using single variable analysis, we found that ABMs with smaller diameter, higher compactness, and lower volume were associated with higher obliteration at 3 years after SRS. And interestingly, margin dose was not found to associate with obliteration in our cohort, although it has been frequently, but not always, reported in the literature to have a positive effect on obliteration. Furthermore, we also did not observe any significant relationship between hypertension, diabetes, smoking, or drug use and obliteration outcomes. This is also a bit controversial because a study from Jefferson with almost 800 patients found that smoking was the only comorbidity that was associated with lower obliteration. However, studies from Pittsburgh that also found no association. When looking at risk factors for a hemorrhage within 3 years after SRS, interestingly, we found that former smokers were 26 times more likely to hemorrhage compared to non-smokers. Current smokers also demonstrated a weak association with hemorrhage, but was not statistically significant. Not surprisingly, high-grade ABMs, including both the modified RBAS and the supplementary grade, were more likely to bleed after SRS. History of prior ABM rupture, however, may be a negative predictor of post-SRS hemorrhage, although it was not significant. Prior embolization showed no effect on either obliteration or hemorrhage. In conclusion, we found that both the modified RBAS and the supplementary grade predicted obliteration in our cohort. High ABMs, especially the larger size component, are associated with increased risk of both treatment failure and post-SRS hemorrhage. Common baseline comorbidities overall did not correlate with outcome in our cohort, although former smokers were found to be more likely to hemorrhage. Overall, this was a fun project to work on from start to finish, and the biggest lesson I learned through this experience was that cohort studies should be interpreted very carefully. We have to take into account the context, such as patient-specific characteristics and the sample size of the study. I'd like to thank my PI and mentor, Dr. Chris Graffio, for his guidance and all of my co-authors. I would also like to thank everyone at UW Neurosurgery for welcoming us and making the past 4 weeks a memorable experience. I want to give a huge shout out to my sub-Is for being fantastic colleagues. here are my references. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Kiana. Any questions?
Dr. Olmo, and I have a couple of comments. The obliteration rate is extraordinarily low, 70%, 69, 70% at 5 years, and
Yes.
a pretty significant number of hemorrhages during follow-up. The questions are how this corresponds with the overall experience, number one. Number two, whether multi-stage fractionation might have been more beneficial for some of these, because all of these, majority were treated by single stage. I think that the other question is what happened in terms of follow-up if the AVM was not closed at follow-up at 3 years. Was there any further treatment such as repeat radiosurgery or consideration of microsurgery, etc.? Obviously, a lot of these people were submitted to radiosurgery because the surgeons felt that they couldn't, in that particular center, they didn't have the expertise to operate on them. But on the other hand, the efficacy is quite low, I would say.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Shaker. Those were great points. So our 3-year obliteration rate at 50% is actually equal to some of the cohorts reported. The 5-year obliteration of 69% was indeed pretty low. However, that's also where I emphasize that when we look at these studies, we have to pay attention to the patient characteristics. In our cohort, the majority of our patients were high-grade AVMs. When you look at what I looked at studies from the literature, they have way fewer. I think I would say the majority of studies had lower grade AVMs at about 60%, 60 to 70%. So if you look at specifically high-grade AVM outcomes, though, our results are actually pretty comparable. And another big factor is the high loss to follow-up. We started with over 80 patients that were treated in this treatment period. However, by the time we sorted through the follow-up, only 50 qualified. So it's possible that those 30-some patients that we lost were doing fine, so they just never returned to get their imaging done. And that could have also lowered our statistics. And regarding what these patients got treated with after, so some of these patients underwent repeated stereotactic radiosurgery. Some of these patients got embolized. And I do not have the number off the top of my head of the follow-up for these patients. And the single stage versus multiple stage, like you pointed out, the majority of our patients did receive single stage SRS. I think our Red-On did not typically prefer to use single stage and only saved multiple stage SRS for patients with extremely large and diffuse SRS. But that is a point that I could discuss with my Red-On mentor. Thank you for that.
When you present data on AVMs, it should be stratified according to the grade. I would recommend to you to look at paper by Josh Shabakis, first author from our center, on multimodal treatment of grade 3, Spessmartin grade 3 AVMs. The results are much, much better than what you have presented here. So it's worth looking at. Maybe there's differences in the characteristics of the patients, and the numbers may be very small in your group.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Well, without further ado, thank you, Kiana. Samantha Sadler from Harvard Medical School. Sam, why don't you get your slides up and then you can tell us a fun fact.
Absolutely. Everyone see my slides here?
Seeing it now, yes.
Great. Hi, so I'm Sam from, I'm sub-I from HMS from Dallas, Texas. Fun fact about me, I'm a certified group fitness instructor. So I've taught spin, indoor cycling, Pilates and bar at multiple institutions and sites. Something I missed, but I am excited to get back at it this upcoming year at HMS. So I'll be teaching.
Dr. Ojiman is a spin meister, so that's great. Thank
Oh,
you.
amazing. We'll have to talk bikes at some point.
Yeah.
All right, so today I'm going to be presenting some of my work with the Golby Lab. This is a lab at Harvard Medical School. It's positioned at Brigham and Women's Hospital specifically, and this is some of the work that we've done together. So first, I'm going to do a brief overview of the need for low-cost neuronavigation systems. We'll talk a little bit about our low-cost neuronavigation system and the future directions where we're taking it and what parts I'm playing in that. So neuronavigation is something that we have used consistently for the last 10 plus years. This is, I believe, many of your institutions use Medtronic, we use BrainLab. It is essential in many cases, as again, surgeon preferences, of course, important, but it is often used for 3D localization of tumors. That is important for preoperative planning, as well as intraoperative resection, understanding the extent of resections, making sure we've taken out the tumor in its entirety. There's accuracy up to 1 to 2 millimeters, which is incredibly accurate. It is a great alternative to intraoperative imaging in many circumstances. However, it is a very costly operation and it is incredibly resource intensive. I recently conducted a survey among neurosurgeons in low resource settings who described a great interest and familiarity with actually neuronavigation technology, as well as a decent access to MRI and CT imaging for their patients, just given other global health efforts up to this point that have facilitated greater imaging access. That being said, this is a service that's widely unavailable for these institutions sheerly due to cost. The cost is incredibly prohibitive and can in many ways be equivalent, and can in many circumstances be equivalent to a hospital's entire yearly budget outside of the neurosurgery department, including all the other departments. So the feasibility of purchasing and accessing these systems as they are today is simply not there. So this is the reason for NewNav being born. NewNav is a low-cost open source neuronavigation system. It's comprised mostly of off-the-shelf components in addition to some specifically designed pieces, which I'll talk about shortly. And this entire system was put together with low resource settings in mind. You can see here, this is our setup, our general setup. Here we have a camera, which is an OptiTrack camera used for motion capture imaging in other non-medical contexts. This is a 3D, this one is a aluminum array that we created with an MIT lab. These are magnetic components that enable the array to be fixated onto a stand that has a secure bolt. This is our version of a Bayfield clamp. And as we'll briefly look at, this is our open source program that enables this system to work and be linked to imaging. Here's another better image. This is what our open source program looks like. This is the user interface. It, in short, will walk users through the registration process using pointers, using the pointer, as well as how to fixate the head, when to fixate the head. And it has gone through multiple iterations. This is the most recent, and I'm happy to talk more about that in detail. But given the time, I thought I would focus on one of the more recent experiments that I designed to look at components of NewNav in order to improve our internal validity. So specifically, this experiment that we performed a couple weeks ago was to determine which pointer design would be the most effective for our system. As you can see here, we created this pointer. This one's out of aluminum. It is autoclave safe. That was a different experiment we performed. But instead of using the round balls that you'll see on most standard industry pointers, we designed this flat reflective tape that was then cut by a perforator and able to be stuck onto these autoclavable aluminum pointers. And we wanted to test whether or not these different designs whether one would be more effective than the other, and in what lighting setting, as well as what position in the room. The reason why we thought that this would be particularly important for these pointers is because of their flat design, rather than having those round balls for reflection. And that was something we wanted to test. So as I just explained, the setup was using this OptiTrack camera calibrated bar that I described earlier. We have the camera version. This is the OptiTrack. There are divots on these bars that have known distances down to the, I believe it's the nanometer, very, very accurate or very, very precise distancing. So we use those known points in space to then take our pointer calibration, calibrate these spots, register these spots, I should say, and determine whether this was accurate using 3 different lighting settings, using the Trump lights, no Trump lights, just room lights, using the BrainLab system and the NewNav system at these points, which I'll briefly talk more about, and using these 5 different pointer designs, the 5th being the BrainLab pointer. Then we moved these objects around the room to 7 different points in space to be sure that distance would not be a confounding factor. Our results demonstrated first that BrainLab was significantly more effective or significantly more accurate. This was something that we expected to see, but was interesting to see comparatively to our system. We also saw that there was no difference between the pointer designs, which was useful for us, and that meaning that we can then provide these options to our low resource setting partners and ask them for their personal preference, as well as determine which of these perhaps are more resilient to repeated use, which ones might be easier to be 3D cut, et cetera. So we can think more on the functional anecdotal side. And just because I'm running out of time here, I will talk briefly about BrainLab as well, but we, moving forward, want to continue to perform these kinds of tests. This was a test that took much planning this is a test that took much planning, but also did not involve a patient. And in order to link these with patient trials, that also takes a lot more effort, and we don't have a lot of intraoperative time available to us. So we are working on creating an anthropomorphic brain model. I'm conducting a systematic review to try and figure out how to best create a phantom with an anthropomorphic phantom with a tumor embedded phantom, so we can start trying to map imaging of these phantoms with our neuronavigation pointer system, as well as provide us an anthropomorphic model through which to further compare BrainLab and NewNav and determine what's an acceptable amount of intraoperative clinical error that can still be allowed, and that way we can provide low resource settings with this technology, recognizing that there may be some circumstances that it cannot be used reliably. So this is our future directions, and also I'm designing tutorial videos for our user interface as well. And thank you so much for letting me briefly talk about this work that I'm really passionate about, and I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Sam. Any questions? That's Jason's. Jason?
Hey, boss. Sam, this is super cool, and I think definitely there's a need out there. 2 comments. One is, and you touched on one of these, which is stereotactic navigation in low resource settings, like let's say Northern Africa, is definitely needed. I think, unfortunately, the access to CT and MRI is still very much an issue there. And without low-cost CT and MRI solutions, a lot of the patients can't afford to get an MRI because they have to pay cash out of pocket. And so I wonder if, in parallel, we really need to be working on low-cost stereotactic imaging acquisition. That was one comment. And then the other comment is, I think another really important detail here that you may have touched on is sterilization. A lot of low resource settings, they don't use autoclave sterilization and they don't like using disposables. They use enzymatic sterilization as their primary modality. And I'm curious, how that would impact what you're working on, how to make you think about things a little bit differently, because I imagine enzymatic sterilization of electronic equipment can be a little tricky. Just kind of get your thoughts on that stuff.
Absolutely. And I'll answer your second question first. I had a photo here of one of these pointers. I am familiar with the lack of autoclave availability. When I was in Uganda, they used just a bucket of chlorhexidine as their sterilization. And because of that, I also had concerns about this pointer having has an anodized covering to it. And so we're actually going to move forward with no anodization, such that we will hopefully preserve the equipment for longer. We won't see this loss of the anodized covering as it's exposed to harsh chemicals repeatedly. We also have designed this so that there are very few components that actually need to be sterilized at all, just the pointer and the reference array at this point. So by making sure that those components are very easily cleaned and are resilient to repeated autoclave or other sterilization techniques, we're hoping that we'll be able to provide a product, if you will, that is resilient with that in mind. Additionally, and then you asked about the stereotactic.
Why don't we have to, I apologize, Sam, we're kind of short of time. This is great. Maybe talk to Jason afterwards. Thanks. That was great, Sam. So Andrew Wong from UCLA, from David Geffen Medical School. Last but not least, it goes alphabetical, I guess. So sorry about your name starting with a W. But go ahead and tell us one fun fact about you.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Logan. Fun fact, I'm an escape room junkie. In particular, I love challenges that are very non-linear. So yeah. I know we're short on time, so I'll try to get this going. So good morning, everyone. I'm Andrew. I'm the subject from UCLA. Today, I'll be presenting on man's best friend, the genomic characterization of pituitary adenomas in humans and canines with Cushing's disease. I have no disclosures. Beginning with some background that I'm sure you're all aware. First described in 1932, Cushing's disease of benign corticotropin adenomas that secrete excess amount of ACTH, causing prolonged exposure to excess glucocorticoids. The precursor polyprotein to ACTH, POMC, is transcribed by TBX19 and synthesized within the anterior pituitary. When ACTH is secreted, Zonophytes, the a lot of cells within the adrenal cortex release cortisol. Overall mortality is increased by up to 5 times in Cushing's disease, but significantly improves after achievement of normal cortisol levels by treatment. However, despite treatment, the reoccurrence rate continues to remain high. Because Cushing's disease is a rare tumor with an incidence of 0.4 per 100,000, research has yielded a limited number of dysfunctional genes. Now, interesting, dogs like my puppies, Winston and Luna, and cats like my Rosie and Kate, along with horses, also develop Cushing's disease with similar clinical presentations and post-surgical reoccurrence rates. In Nature's 2005 article, we now know that humans and canines are 95% genetically identical compared to 85% with mice, leading to some unique considerations of using canines for eventual therapeutic modeling. This motivated us to investigate a more complete catalog of genomic aberrations between Cushing's adenomas in humans and canines that may lead to dysfunctional protein expression. At the end of our study, our cohort had 50 human Cushing's adenomas, most patients identifying as women around the ages of 45 from African-American or Black backgrounds that had macroadenoma resected with TNTS. Similarly, canines, we had 25 of them, most were female, around the ages of 6 to 7, mixed breeds, also had macroadenoma with TNTS resections. For both groups, we purchased 2 normal anterior pituitary glands from a company that were age and gender matched. To test our hypothesis, a series of 3 experiments were performed. First was whole exome sequencing to identify somatic recurrent mutations. Second was RNA sequence to examine differential gene profiles. And third was immunohistochemistry for RNA sequencing expression at the protein level. Now, this is a representative copy number variation from a whole exome sequencing in humans and canines with Cushing's disease. On your y-axis, you have is on your rows are your represented samples, and on the top graph is your logistic profile, which essentially identifies regions of genomes that are significantly amplified in blue or deleted in red. Overall, we kind of see that there's prominent regions gains in chromosomes 5, 7, 8, 9, 12, and it seems like 13, and there seems to be losses in 11 and 19. However, when examined broadly, there were no focal gains or losses in recurrent copy number mutations across our samples. Now, this is the broad illustration of unsupervised hierarchical clustering, showing that the normal pituitary specimens cluster separately from Cushing's pituitary adenomas for both species. Defined by greater than a twofold change, genes were grouped together by overexpression in red and underexpression in blue. Overall, heterogeneity in gene expression was found in individual Cushing's pituitary adenomas in both species. Now, extracting from the RNA sequencing cluster data, gene level summaries were performed, overlapping the two data sets demonstrate that there are 14 overexpressed and 239 underexpressed genes between dog and man. Working with the smaller number here of the 14, the genes are listed here. And here is a proposed molecular mechanism interaction model that's illustrated here. I actually created this model as an attempt to kind of force myself to better understand the functions of these 14 genes in space. But what I didn't fully appreciate then was that the very complexity of these interactions will allude to the field's approach in developing therapeutics for Cushing's disease that will be discussed later. Here are the gene level summary box plots comparing the shared 14 overexpressed genes. On your y-axis, I log transformed the RNA sequencing's fragments per kilobase of transcripts per million reads, or essentially FPKM levels for normalization or ease of viewing. And then on your x-axis, you have your comparisons of Cushing's to normal across both species. Below on this table, here are the significant overexpression results between the two species. Here we can see that there are 4 significantly overexpressed genes, TBX19, RASF, MEMLD1, and MNX1. Furthermore, to confirm protein translation, immunohistochemistry was performed on 4 of the aforementioned overexpressed genes. For our positive controls, we see that POMC is expressed in both Cushing's disease and healthy. However, extensive 3+ nuclear staining were observed in MAMLD1, RASF, and there is nuclear with cytoplasmic staining seen in MNX1. As expected, TBX19 was also weakly stained in both groups because it is, as mentioned, the upstream transcription factor of POMC. So in conclusion, it's important to keep in mind that this current investigation was neither a discovery cohort for dicromycin nor a functional assessment study. Rather, it's a cohort aimed to broadly profile the somatic gene aberrations of Cushing's disease. So the takeaways are: 1, differentially expressed genes were identified that were common between humans and dogs. 2, genes that are stained exclusive to only Cushing's disease invite further functional assessment, along with exploration behind remaining shared downstream genes. And 3, given the rarity of these tumors and limited modeling examples, canines may provide suitable variant cohorts to test novel therapeutic approaches. Now, originally, I wanted to kind of go over this really quickly, but what this really is just to kind of examine where this research kind of fits in the current landscape. And what we can kind of observe here is that even among study variations of the size of the adenoma, patient's background seems to contribute to the variations in genetic results. Thus, from a macroscopic perspective, maybe the takeaway is that genetic origins of pituitary adenomas are heterogeneous, and corticotrophic adenomas can be pathologically distinct despite having similar clinical presentations. And finally, from a macroscopic perspective, we can see that dysfunction in common signaling pathways, such as EGFR or Notch signaling, may potentiate POMC and ACTH expression. This is just the current clinical trials that are currently being run. And finally, I just want to give appreciation to Dr. Ella Bogan and the faculty residents for the endless teachings and mentorships, the staff and the rest of the department for being so welcoming, and also all the other semis. Thank you.
Andrew, I apologize to you I didn't want you to rush. I wanted you to get your time in. I wanted to be fair to all our sub-Is.
Not a problem, sir.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Any questions? Any from our endoscopic experts? Anything? Well,
I've got one. This is Manny
okay.
Ferreira. Very nice talk and all encompassing. In your copy number alteration slide, you show nicely that there really seem to be 3 subgroups of tumors. One with a lot of gains and losses throughout all the chromosomal regions, some with none at all, and then others with maybe 1 or 2. How do you resolve that with the fact that the phenotype is identical amongst these patients?
I think that's a really great question. I think statistically speaking, at the end of the day, the results were not significant when you look at them across all samples. When I did attempt to kind of look into the individual subgroups, I wasn't able to identify any like commonalities that were significantly able to really confidently being able to report. Hence why the copy number results, at least in our data sets, were not significant, but I am aware of the Dutch group, of the Netherlands group for USP8, along with the Chinese group, I think it's also USP8 or 48. But then those results were actually not able to be repeated on further subsequent pituitary adenomyosis genetic sequencing in the United States, actually. So a little bit interesting. And we also didn't see USP8 for some reason. Thank you.